So that tends to make me feel better than the way it was last week, because last week is just me, blah, 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 blah. So maybe it'll actually work this way. We'll see. Because I'd like to have for some of you to read like we used to when we gathered here in the physical together. Whoever sat on my left would read. There's coffee over here and water, if you'd like. And we're going to pick up on part 6. It's page 248. And the bold is What Made the West the Best. And this is really the heartland of his proposition, is that the West is better, and better to the degree that it's superlative, it's best. And so then you can get bogged down in a real conversation here about, is there good or better or best? And that's a conversation that the postmodernists always want to have, that there's no better way and that every way is good and that you don't have the right. And they underscore that with the ideas of inclusion and diversity, and so there's something emotional that happens there, because we want everybody to be included, and it seems unfair that no matter who you are or how you are, that your diversity shouldn't keep you from being included, and the idea of being equitable, that sounds like a good idea, but not in the way that this modern iteration is presented. And the acronym should be DIE, because that's exactly what it does to a culture and to the individuals in it when it's approached. Because by equity, they mean equity and equality and outcome. And by diversity, they mean you have to accept anything regardless of how atrocious it is. And by inclusion, it means you have to include everybody, no matter how dysfunctional or barbaric their positions are. So every major corporation, UAB included, has diversity, equity, and inclusion training, I'm sure. And so that really is the function of academia, producing social justice warriors that now have filled the human resource departments, and it's all over the country. And so here we are. This is a culture war, and it's yet to be seen exactly what will happen. But the proposition here, just in this bold title here in part 6, What Made the West the Best, you have to ask and answer questions. Is the West the best? What metric do you use to determine that? How do you go about assessing good or better? Is there a gradient value system in the world, in reality, in life? Are some things better than other things? How do you determine that? And then what is the best? And once you begin that conversation, that's an ethical discussion, and you're in the realm of theology. You're in the realm of, because you're quickly going to go to good and evil, and there's no other way to do that. Because if it's better, then it's good, and if it's worse, then it's evil. Because the metric that we use to determine that is probably platformed off of an idea that there is a human universal, and there are a lot of human universals, but down at the base level there is a human universal, and it's pain and suffering. That's bad. And if you're in pain and if you're suffering, you know that's bad. And if somebody that you love is in pain and suffering, you know that's bad. So if that's bad, what's better? Well, whatever you do to alleviate pain and suffering. What creates a world where there's less of that? Well, that gets into the area of good. So as we're moving toward good and we're moving away from what's bad or what's evil, we see best or better, and we kind of can see it in a graduated sense. Ultimately, we know that God is at the top of that value hierarchy. And we know that God is the very best. And so his ways are best. We're on page 249. If you didn't get a book off the table, there's a few over here. I'll get a box this week for all of you that don't have one. But what made the West the best? What kind of a metric do you use to determine best? And when you do that, you also, implicit in that is worse, you know? So what are your thoughts about that before we ever begin reading? Those, by the way, are terrible chairs. That's like talking about good, better, or worst, or best. That's worst. But, so, any insight, any conversation about that? What's better, people having plenty to eat or people starving? Yeah, we're all in favor of that. If you do things that make people starve, is that good or worse? This is like you're at the eye doctor. 1 or 2, 3, and I hate those decisions. It's like, can't tell, do it again. But, so if you do things that cause pain and suffering, that's probably worse. So then we can see that there's a graduated system of behavior and ideologies and maybe governments, maybe policies, maybe all sorts of things that kind of fill in the blanks along the way up toward better or best. Now, we say the West is the best. That's his assertion here. Well, I think that's indisputable. More provision for more people, more opportunity for more people, more actualization for more people, less government oppression, less systemic suffering, you know? And if you don't believe that that's true, you need to visit third world settings where everybody suffers every day just to go get a bucket of dirty water to bring up to the house for your family. And disease is rampant, and things that you consider to be normal benefits of a civilized society, those things are not available there. Those government policies that create that are not good. There are better ways. So what's happening when the Harvard PhD stands up in the middle of a presentation and decries the fact that someone is feeling good about lessening the practice of widow burning in India? And her response was, who are you to say that your ways are better? Who are you to say that that's not a viable approach to life? Burn the widows. Well, I mean, seems self-evident to us. Seems self-evident to the widow. You know? What is that? What is her voice? What is her position? What is she espousing? And she's teaching at one of the most influential places of academia in the world. I can't read your sign language. Yes, you can have coffee. Use your words. Use them. And there's water and coffee there, so help yourself. Okay, come on, you got to talk to me now. This is not going to work. You're sandbagging me.
Well, the worst seems like human life is not valued.
Exactly. Okay, so out in the arena of better, why do people value human life? Because human life historically has not been valued, and our founding documents say these things are self-evident. So, what is the quality that makes you in the West value life?
God values life.
You're made in the image of God. And that's the underlying premise. That's why we don't use cruel or unusual punishment if we're going to kill you. Can't be cruel, can't be unusual. Just the regular old standard, nothing unusual. Like you can't be an executioner in a Far Side cartoon, you know. Today, we've got something special. Yeah, but that's even the most despised individual, Jeffrey Dahmer. Although there may be some people despised more than Jeffrey. All he did was eat people. So we value life, yeah, and that's better, right? What about those third world settings and those corrupt places, Nazi Germany and Bolshevik to present in Soviet Union, then Russia, Mao in China, and all of that? What makes those systems worse? And why does somebody stand in Harvard University and proclaim the virtues of socialism, communism, and decry the idea of stopping people from burning widows? And nobody was there just saying, you have to stop. They were just giving them information that made them think in a different way and helping them to dispose of cultural artifacts that were terrible.
The Russians espouse the Christian ideas that throughout the Bible and then embrace naturalism. Through the views of naturalism, evolution, macroevolution being its primary driving force, they got rid of the value of human life. And so I think that's one of the biggest contributors.
They did. And to promote political positions and the positions of the state, they, like if you were a successful farmer, which just meant you had a house and a cow, they took all your stuff and killed you or shipped you off to Siberia because you were affluent. And they had to. And so when communism espouses everybody equal, it always turns out everybody equally poor and miserable. Now you might say, well, in China it's not that way. People are, yeah, but it's because they're utilizing capitalism to finance their military. They had a stroke of genius. But out in the countryside, it's miserable. People are starving. They're moving to the cities and they're not doing much better there. Anything else about any of this? Why is the West the best? How do you determine that? What's the metric you use? Is it unreasonable to say that the world, reality as we know it, is bounded by an ethical framework that seems naturally ingrained into it? People that don't believe in God see that. We see it and we ascribe it to God.
I think one of the make the ways of basis
Speak loudly because we're doing a YouTube here.
freedom of the priest's word. So in liberty, we have freedom to go into a church setting and hear the priest's word on a regular basis.
Well, so far, yeah, Brother David espouses that we have freedom of religion and we can have freedom of speech, but so far that's true. But postmodernism is working feverishly to suspend your right to be able to do that. And they start out on the edges by canceling you or ridiculing you, but they're going for the whole kibosh. They want to shut down the idea of free speech, and they want to control speech under the rubric of diversity and celebrating inclusivity and equity, you know? But it's not really what they're after. Okay. Yep.
Guinness talks about one of the greatest virtues of America, at least in past times, has been the fact that the common thing held in that, like, valued, so freedom or liberty being held as a common thing that is loved in America, and that being one of its greatest virtues, because that's a thing that is rallied and that thing is virtuous or good. But obviously, because of the inception of America and those Judeo-Christian values, those things on some level being held in common, and though that being virtuous is one of the things that has contributed to the success or the goodness, if you would, of America.
Yeah, so it's a derivative of the fact that you are a unique individual made in the image of God, and who has the right to displace your sovereignty, your personal sovereignty, you know, and he's right about that. And although we haven't practiced it perfectly, and we don't do everything well, and there's a lot of corruption here, and a whole lot of sin, and a lot of very little is done biblically here. But if you just get a little bit of this biblical presentation and implement it, it could change your world. And that's the premise of this book. And the Buddhists didn't do it, and the Hindus didn't do it, and Islam hasn't done it, and the communists haven't done it. But in the West, we've enjoyed just an anomaly in history, a productive, effective society for the individual.
It's interesting, in all of those situations, it's the Bible that, so they're starting from the beginning of their whole moral outlook, if there's a morality, is, okay, the Bible is exactly wrong, so how do we go about interpreting life? So if everything in the Bible is wrong, there is no God, you know, you don't treat others as you would like to be treated yourself, and all of the presuppositions
Exactly.
are not created in the image of God.
Yeah.
So all of those things lead to communism, the atrocities of the Chinese, massive extinctions of people, all of the things, and including today, where people start with, okay, so if there's no God, then who are you to tell me that I can't burn widows?
Well, that's what Dostoevsky said. He said, if there's no God, anything is permitted.
Anything's permitted. That's exactly right. So they're beginning at a supposition that they then must do amazingly complex things in their mind and in just human morality to be able to say this is okay. I mean, everything from the existence of the universe is from some crazy, you know, that's every 10 years or so make up a new idea just so that we don't have to say there's a God that created the universe. You know, even though it's beyond unimaginable, you know, odds that this would actually occur just spontaneously. It's like there's no way that can happen.
That's right.
You know, same thing with like burning widows, you know, at the stake or whatever. I mean, that lady who stood up and said that, if she were a widow, or if she could in any way put her mindset into that widow's position, she would be arguing the other way, right?
Yeah. So if you took all of their positions, wherever they fall on the postmodernist agenda scale, wherever they fall, their positions are all united around the idea of undermining and destroying the Judeo-Christian foundation.
Right.
That's the thing they have in common. That's why the blazing liberals in America are supporting the Islamists, who hold altogether different views about feminism and about so many other things that the liberals say they prize. But the place where they connect is death to the United States, death to Israel, you know. Yeah.
Right, so that's the background, is basically having somewhat of an understanding of major concepts of the Bible and saying, okay, all of those are wrong. Let's start from there. And then they build their structure.
Yeah, and it's we see it for what it is. It's not simply political, economic, cultural. It's demonic, and I know what underlies it. So then we're quickly off into, this is not just better or worse. This is good and evil, you know, And, well, we better get into the book now. Who's going to be my reader here? I need somebody here that can read close to my microphone, so somebody might could sit right here and read, because Sister Birdie's freaking out because she's the only person on my left here. And I just told her that the person on my left is my reader. We're on page 248. And you have to be bold and strong because Magalvati will throw some things at you. Like Magalvati. 248, yeah, the heading.
I see.
And the quote there we want.
Part 6, what made the West the best? For the individual
What we've
person-
been talking about is the fact that you can have better and worse, or good and evil, and we use the biblical metric to establish that. So that would start a dogfight right there, just that question. But not here. And we see it rationally and skeptically and cynically. We see it. We know all the warts and the problems, but we know this is the best because it's founded on God's way. All right, read on.
For the individual person in the West, this myth of original sin and redemption is turned into the ritual of confessing the guilt. The confession of guilt not only relieves the confessor of the burden of guilt, it also purifies him. If the confessing individual proves to be innocent, but nevertheless takes on the burden of collective guilt, he sanctifies his own mundane individuality. He performs Christomimesis and, as a political leader, partakes of the charisma of the hero.
Which is redundant. Christomimesis is simply acting like Christ, or what would Jesus do? That, read on.
Thus, the European ritual of confessing guilt for sins of the past relies on a mythology that remains even if the political representatives performing the ritual are utterly secularized individuals who ignore the cultural origin of their actions.
Yeah, so we have a lot of things that you might call vestigial structures that are still in our culture, even though the people that have operated within them don't believe in God anymore, don't believe in the Bible anymore, but they still practice things like ask somebody if they believe slavery is wrong. And anybody with half a brain will tell you, well, of course it's wrong. Slavery is wrong. And then the question is why? Why is slavery wrong? If you don't believe in the Word of God and you don't believe in the value of human life and you don't believe the individual is made in the image of God, slavery's always existed. I mean, in every place in history where there's somebody bright enough to say, I could have him do this work for me. You know, that kind of thing. So it's always existed, but we're the only country in all of history that fought a war and suspended slavery. Now, the Brits did it through Parliament, but we did it with a war. And we buried hundreds of thousands of young white men that fought to make that a reality. So go home, Black Lives Matter. And everything is racist and everything, I mean, that's just absurd beyond comprehension. Don't even entertain that conversation. Just have somebody walk through the graveyards at Gettysburg and other places like that and read all the names of those Union soldiers. Just normal people that fought for a really, really good cause, you know? By the way, the South was wrong and consequently evil. Okay, just want to clear the air of all that. Okay, read on.
Morality. Why are some less corrupt? In films such as Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps, and Social Network, Hollywood is showing secular capitalism changing America's motto to "In Greed We Trust." In the summer of 2010, the U.S. Congress passed a 2,300-page act to regulate the financial sector. This act is an admission of the massive corruption in that sector of the economy. Wall Street's corruption, however, has yet to become a part of Main Street. Growing immorality has once again begun to hurt the church's credibility. Nevertheless, the traditional morality of the West, easily evident in small towns and villages, is incomprehensible to most non-Western visitors. For example, in 1982, I was traveling to England for a conference on economic development. Leaving New Delhi after midnight, I was sleepy, but the Sikh gentleman next to me talked nonstop. He was returning to England after visiting his parents in a Punjab village in northwest India. He could not comprehend why I was living in poverty serving the poor. He took it as his mission to persuade me to settle in England. Doing business in England, he argued, was easy and profitable. After being harassed for more than an hour, I began to lose my patience. But something intrigued me. He could not speak a single sentence without making a mistake. How could someone who spoke such poor English succeed as a businessman in England? So I asked, "Tell me, sir, why is business so easy in England?" "Because everyone trusts you there," he answered, without pausing for a moment. Having not yet ventured into a business, I did not grasp how important trust was to success in business. I pushed back my seat and went to sleep. After the conference, Mr. John von Barneveld hosted me in his home at Doorn, Holland. One afternoon, John said to me, "Come, let us get some milk." We walked between gorgeous, moss-covered trees to a dairy farm. I had never seen anything like this, a neat and tidy dairy farm with about 100 cows but no human beings. The cows were milked automatically and the milk was pumped into a large boiler-like tank. We entered the milk room, where John opened the tap and filled his jug. Then he reached out to a windowsill and pulled down a bowl full of cash. He took out his wallet, drew a 20-guilder note, and put it into the bowl. He helped himself to the change from the bowl, put it into his wallet, picked up the jug, and started to walk out. I couldn't believe my eyes. "Man," I said, "if you were an Indian, you would take the milk and the money." John laughed, but in that instant I understood what that Sikh businessman had been trying to tell me. If this were India and I walked out with the money and the milk, the dairy owner would need to hire a cashier. Who would pay for the cashier? I, the consumer, would, and the price of milk would go up. But if the consumer were corrupt, why should the dairy owner be honest? He would add water to the milk to make more money. I would then be paying more for adulterated milk. I would complain, "The milk is adulterated. The government must appoint inspectors." Who would pay for the inspectors? I, the taxpayer, would. But if the consumer, producer, and the supplier were corrupt, why should the inspectors be honest? They would extract bribes from the supplier. If he did not bribe them, the inspectors would delay the supply and ensure that the milk curdled before it got to me. Who would pay for the bribe? Again, I, the consumer, would pay the additional cost. By the time I paid for the milk, the cashier, the water, the inspector, and the bribe, I would have little money left to buy chocolate for the milk, so my children would not drink the milk and would be weaker than the Dutch children. Having spent extra money on the milk, I would not be able to take my children out for ice cream. The cashier, water, bribe, and inspector add no value to the milk. The ice cream industry does. My corruption keeps me from patronizing a value-adding business. That reduces our economy's capacity to create jobs. Some years ago, I shared this story in a conference in Indonesia. An Egyptian participant laughed the most. As all eyes turned to him, he explained, "We Egyptians are cleverer than these Indians. If no one was watching, we would take the milk, the money, and the cows." The gentleman was too charitable toward us Indians.
Okay, what's the point? Baseline, we're talking about why the West is better.
He's talking about the value of integrity, biblical integrity.
Yeah, and Covey's speed of trust. A home, a family, a relationship, a business, a culture, anything moves with less friction if there's trust. And trust implies integrity. I trust you, I assume you're going to do the right thing, you know? And so, you know, there's little tomato stands all around in the summertime where you go, and there's an ice vending place where you go and you just put your money in and take the ice, and we're kind of amazed by those things, you know? But they work to large degree. And the more of that you have, the better it is. The less of that you have, you know, I mean, you don't want to go live in India in most settings, and you don't want to go live in Egypt where they would steal the milk and the cows, you know. Why? Because their ways are not as effective as ways. What's the foundational problem? Well, the foundational problem is that they're not Judeo-Christian. And those ideas that we share come from the Word of God, and they work, and they're better. Okay, so, all right, and he's just giving you a very hands-on, real-world example of why the West is better. Now, I had thought to just read through Fox News headlines today, because we're a long way from really good, a long way from, I mean, this morning Atlanta is on fire, 10 killed in a shooting in a public area outside LA. Just how far do you want to go? You know, more documents found at Biden's Delaware home. So it goes to the highest office in the land. And there's plenty of corruption and there's plenty of trouble. The question is, if we get further in this today, if we go deeply enough, we'll find a conversation about John Wesley and the Great Awakening in Britain that coincided with the Great Awakening in North America. And we could use one of those, and we could have one of those. But it's yet to be seen. Okay, read on.
Similar kind of thing, when we were in China, one of our interpreters told us, it kind of shocked me a little bit, that in China, families take care of family members only. Only. There is no concept or no tendency towards helping anyone outside of your family in any way. I mean, like, helping somebody who's having a hard time, or working together with somebody to do something they need, or just, you know, anything you can do to help somebody else.
Well, they're 3 generations deep in the government being responsible.
It's only family. That's your only responsibility.
Yeah. You know, and because of that structure that affects their economy, they don't care if a lot of weak people, sick people, and old people die. You know, and so COVID, they weren't all that worried about all of that. They were having mass burials with bulldozers. Cuomo didn't go that bad, but he did put the sick folks back in the nursing homes. And I never heard anybody scream about it, but they were running about I don't know what the final tally was, but it was billions of dollars they were running in arrears in Medicare in New York, and he just cleared the deck of a lot of old people by clearing out the nursing homes. Did it on purpose, and that's an ethical decision based on the substructure of ideology, just like they would do in China or anywhere else. So it exists there, it exists here. And so anyway, I hear a trumpet. All right. Cynicism, Indian cynicism.
Cynicism in India. Many years after my trip to Holland, I heard Uncle Emmanuel complain that they were getting highly adulterated milk in Mussoorie. I told him that Ruth had finally found an honest milkman and that we were getting pure milk. After I had spent half an hour trying to persuade the uncle that they should buy milk from our milkman, he got tired and dismissed me as utterly naive. It's impossible to get pure milk in Mussoorie, he said. Your milkman must be very clever. He must be adding something other than water to the milk, something that you haven't figured out as yet. Taking the hint, I changed the conversation to the question of corruption. Uncle, a retired railway engine driver, told me that he had just heard from a friend of his, also a retired driver, that his son had spent 9 months and 30,000 Indian rupees in bribes and still had not gotten a job with the railways. This was in spite of the policy that after an employee retires, one of his children will be given preference in recruitment. Then Uncle described at length how he became employed in the 1940s. Here's the abridged version. The British were ruling India. The recruiting officer examined his certificates, ordered an immediate in-house physical checkup, offered him a cup of tea, looked at the doctor's report, and ordered that an appointment letter must be given to him the next day. The following morning, the clerk issued the appointment letter with another cup of tea. No bribes, no strings pulled, and no delays. Recruitment was a clean, prompt, and professional affair, based solely on merit. The consequence was competent employees who were loyal to the enterprise, proud of their work, and respectful of law, authority, and the government. That era, the uncle lamented, had gone for good. 50 years of independence offered no hope for the future.
Okay, why the contrast? Why a better system from the Brits, and now, down the timeline after the Brits are gone, it has collapsed into bribery and nepotism and corruption.
Because the British common law is based on biblical worldview.
Yeah, and what's the substructure of India? Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, thousands of years of it. It doesn't go away easy. So that was kind of top down impressed upon them. And while the Brits were there, India was a better place. But they were suffering under colonialism, which people tear their clothes and throw dirt in the air about colonialism, but it's the best thing that ever happened to India. Do any of you know about Rhodesia? About South Africa? Absolutely prosperous, wonderfully effective, commercial success, all of that. But after the colonialists were driven out or overcome, they went back to tribalism and could not effectively utilize their resources. Just a weird little irony in life, that those things happen. But it's a better way of doing business, a better way of living life, a better way of implementing government and utilizing resources. And so you can get in dogfights about all of this, but it's an interesting thing. Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe, you can't have enough Zen dollars to make a living. They're worthless. It's just Robert Mugabe and communism has come, and they can't function. And now they can't feed themselves either because they drove out all the successful farmers. So, well, we've got our freedom. Yeah, you too. But what's wrong with freedom when you don't have the substructure to live not only as a free person, but to be effective and to do things that your children need you to do for them?
Lawless chaos.
And it's not freedom.
Huh?
I said it's not actually freedom.
Well, there's usually when you talk about freedom, people think about tyrannical structures. But there's other types of tyranny, like internal tyranny, things that rule you from inside you that destroy every good thing in your life and all around you. Yeah, and the Jews know that. They got rid of Pharaoh, and they didn't have the capacity to govern themselves, So anyway, okay. The effect of corruption.
Transparency International, a German non-governmental organization, has long recognized the correlation between corruption and poverty. Each year, TI publishes a Global Corruption Perceptions Index that ranks countries from the least corrupt to the most corrupt. The index for 2009 ranks 180 countries with 10 points allotted for a totally clean country. No country, of course, gets 10 points. A majority of the countries receive fewer than 5 points, meaning that they are more corrupt than clean. Here are extracts from the 2009 rankings.
Yeah, so not too bad. 7 out of 10, 7.5 out of 10 for the United States. New Zealand. Now, Singapore is a dictatorship. You know why Singapore is so nice and clean and everything? Because they beat you publicly. They flog you publicly if you throw trash down on the street. But it's a beautiful place. And they have appropriated British common law in a lot of ways for their economic base. And so they're tremendously successful. But they're very, very austere at the same time. And you got drugs, you just die. That takes care of that. It's very effective. Huh?
They're transparent about it.
They are. Big signs in the airport, everywhere else. Do drugs here, you die. Maybe not like that, but. And people go there and do drugs and die. Yeah, okay. Well, now there's a question at the top of 253.
Does poverty cause corruption? Or does corruption cause poverty?
The chicken and the egg. Well, what do you think? What are your thoughts?
Well, you could argue corruption causes poverty just from earlier when he was saying if someone adulterated the milk, then it cost the consumer. And then if they needed an inspector, then there was more cost to the consumer. So that corruption, like that example of corruption, did contribute to or would contribute to poverty.
The original human condition being the Garden of Eden, we had no corruption there. We had a paradise, but then when corruption entered in, then poverty came after.
Hunger, need, want, all of that. Yeah, so the idea then that there could be noble, honest, trustworthy, poor people is not unreasonable to you. Yeah. So, so what's happening in Mexico right now? We have a resident Mexican with us. Kinda, sorta. But what's happening in Mexico right now?
The cartels are trying to run the government. I know they're
Trying, they're not trying.
Right. They're advancing themselves in technology. They're above the government. The government they're sending their soldiers out to do patrols in the back of Toyotas and stuff like that, while the cartels are flying drones. So it's a mismatch, and it's basically a bunch of cartel families running the entire country.
And it's drugs, but now it's human trafficking too, which both are phenomenally productive. And both of those are so destructive to the human condition. They have to fall on the side of this conversation down at the evil level, right? Worse. And so those are not good things. So anything that alleviates that or mitigates that is good, or at least better, right? So we have all of these people coming. And who's producing all the fentanyl that's coming across the board?
Cartels.
Chinese. And they're making money doing it. And it's a strategic thing because they are our adversaries economically and politically and militarily. So it's good for them to kill 100 relatively healthy young Americans every year, 100,000 every year. So it's more than that, at any rate. Who do you know in recent news coverage that might have business arrangements and agreements with the Chinese? Huh?
Yeah.
Hmm? Well, who's the big guy?
The president.
Oh, the president. Yeah, and his son has all sorts of financial arrangements with China. Matter of fact, he pays rent to his daddy, 50 grand a month, that comes straight to him from the Chinese. And the Penn Center, where all the documents were recently found, it's funded by the Chinese. And so why might this administration not want Arizona to take matters in their own hands and put shipping containers up as a barrier to uncontrolled immigration. Well, maybe corruption is at the base of it. Maybe there's a lot of money and maybe there's a lot of influence. But it is so obvious, so stinking obvious. And it's like, surely that can't be true because it's so obvious and so outrageous at the same time. But I'd like to hear a compelling argument as to why it's not true. So what then is corruption costing us? What's happening to us in our culture and in our economy? What's happening to us? And these are not just
People are dying.
Mexicans, Latin Americans, South Americans. There are many, many Africans, and one poor guy that fought alongside our special forces trekked all the way across the world, came in through South America, got mugged and beaten, made his way across the border, and when he got in, he turned himself over to authorities because they have his biometrics because he participated in our war in Afghanistan. They promptly put him in a federal lockup, and he has not seen the light of day because nobody wants to be reminded that we deserted all those Afghans over there. All kinds of outrageous things going on. And then just some wonderful little families trying to find a better place to live and chance for their children. They're coming across. But what's happening? What will happen to us culturally, economically? You got any views on that or any speculations on that?
It's like water dripping directly on a foundation over a long period of time. There is erosion and corrosion that happens and the deterioration of fundamental things that are important to the success and the longevity of this culture. And so as it is flooded with other things that are not good, if you would, or are evil, it will corrode that, and ultimately the culture will lose its value and its everything that it can offer in terms of virtue to men and families. Those things will dissipate and they will go away.
What's happening in Center Point, Huffman, Eastlake, Woodlawn right now? Tarrant.
The crime is high.
Well, they're being overrun
Yeah.
by Latinos. But most of the Latinos are two-parent families working at least 2 jobs. Children are in the home, and a lot of them exhibit cultural behaviors that are really consistent with our Judeo-Christian foundations. So I'm just pushing back a little bit because maybe there's some good stuff. Of course, MS-13's in there too. Cut your head off and send it to your mama in a box, you know. But all sorts of possibilities. And see, for us as apostolics, we can have 2 conversations about it. We can have a political, secular, economic conversation that I had with the Alcantara boys really early on when they first came over, and we were having that 20-year Bible study at Bongiorno's. And they were like, it's not fair, it's not right to keep people out, you know? And I said, well, how many people can you have over for dinner? And that's as simple as I can put it. But I mean, Mallory, how many people could you have over for dinner?
Maybe like 10.
10?
Maybe.
When do we come? What are we having?
Pizza.
Everybody likes pizza. But the suggestion is probably a limit to that, huh? Until it's just abject pandemonium and you're not able to sustain or support that group of people, you know. So the drip, 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 drip is at some point our social institutions and our health care and all the other governmental structures and all, at some point, we won't be able to sustain all of it. You know, I don't know what that point is. So there's a secular economic conversation you can have about this. What's the other conversation? Yeah, the other conversation is strictly spiritual, biblical, evangelistic. And it's like, well, don't know what the law is all about, and I don't know how to fix it, and I don't know which way we're going in it, but they're here, and we're here, and they belong to God, and if we can reach them, we're going to reach them. You know? Well, one night in church, we're requesting prayer for somebody to securely, safely make it over the border illegally. God bless them as they break these laws. God help them as they're making their way over. Keep them safe and keep them healthy. And my wife said, so, we're praying for lawbreakers? I said, yeah, apparently we are. You know, you don't seem to be troubled by the contradiction in this. It's like, well, I feel conflicted about it, but I know it's the right thing. You know? So, anyway. If the law said you had to turn all the Jews over to the Nazis, would you hide a Jew? You probably would not, because it'd get you and all your family killed. Took extreme courage to do that. But you'd like to think that you would. Seems obvious that it would be a good thing. I have a Jew. All right. See, we're not going to make much. See, I was here all by myself, minding my own business, making tremendous progress through this book. We're not making any progress at all right now. And it's absolutely your fault. All right, read on.
I can read 2 times fast.
Can you?
Yeah.
You're like those guys at the end of the advertisement that give you all the disclaimers. Your head may fall off, your knees may break, your blood will turn to curdled milk. But this is the most popular medicine of this kind. And they play this nice music in the background.
His family's running through a field.
Yeah.
I can do that for this.
Like, I can see all kind of families running through a field.
Right.
Running in terror, fields on fire. Or you mean like happy family,
Oh, yeah.
sunshine and all that.
Right, whatever you choose.
Read.
Whether the chicken comes first or the egg is an interesting but theoretical question. Peter Egan, TI chairman in 2002, emphasized the role corruption plays in keeping countries poor.
Okay, did we answer the chicken and the egg question? Theologically, what came first?
Correct.
Chickens and eggs.
The chicken cake.
Theologically, the chicken came first. Like I'm standing in the foyer with a guy the other night, and he's asking me about, what if God used evolution and Adam was the product of evolution? And he had an Abel. Not because he needed one, because Jesus had one and God gave him one, because he was made in the image of God. But the chicken comes before the egg, because God made all the animals, and then they just did what animals do. Okay, because if God made an egg and there was no chicken, who would sit on it? How would it hatch? Theological dilemmas. Read on.
Political elites and their cronies continue to take kickbacks at every opportunity. Hand in glove with corrupt business people, they are trapping whole nations in poverty and hampering sustainable development. Corruption is perceived to be dangerously high in poor parts of the world, but also in many countries whose firms invest in developing nations. Politicians increasingly pay lip service to the fight against corruption, but they fail to act on the clear message of TI's CPI, that they must clamp down on corruption to break the vicious cycle of poverty and graft. Corrupt political elites in the developing world, working hand in hand with greedy business people and unscrupulous investors, are putting private gain before the welfare of citizens and the economic development of their countries. Eigen considers corruption to be a major roadblock to development. He blames it on the political and economic elite, not on the poor. TI has released such CPIs for many years now. They are finding that hypocrisy or lip service and corruption are increasing in many parts of the world. Egan appeals to political leaders in the developing world to exert political force to eradicate corruption, but he complains that such appeals aren't working. An important finding of the CPI is that the least corrupt countries are the Protestant countries, that is, secular nations whose cultures were shaped decisively by the Bible. The only exception is Singapore, a tiny city-state. Let us ignore the results of British administration and assume that even though dictatorship usually increases corruption, at least in Singapore it has uprooted some of the corruption. The Singapore experiment raises these questions. Will Singapore remain corruption-free after the dictators are gone? Could the methods of a city-state be used in large countries where an individual cannot oversee the overall administration? Does Singapore's dictatorship demonstrate that when you rely exclusively on force to eradicate corruption, you free a people from freedom as well as from corruption?
Okay, first question. Will Singapore remain corruption-free after the dictators are gone? That's the question. What's the answer?
I don't
I
think
would say no,
Why?
because they don't have people forcing it.
Yeah, so that's what happens when the dictators are gone. The force is gone, but you're suggesting there's another level of conversation there. What's the nature of man?
To go the easy way.
Yeah, men like rivers, but men are corrupt. We're corrupt. That's our nature. If we're going to live for God, we got to overcome our nature. So it's the natural state of man is to be corrupt. When you're finding a culture that is less corrupt or is in some degree good, that's an aberration. That's a historical anomaly. That something happened there. Well, you can't do this top down, you know? So it has to do with that Judeo-Christian training. Isn't that interesting that most of the good that you find would be in Protestant nations? Like where? In you know, Central America, Mexico, South America, they are called Christian, but they're not. They're Catholic, and Catholic is not Christian. Catholic is oppressive, totalitarian. It is not Christian, and it's never done anything to elevate its people. It's done a lot to squeeze them for the last drop of gold, but it hasn't done anything to elevate them. If you find Catholicism in a predominantly Protestant environment, then they are elevated like a rising tide lifts all boats or ships. So, all right, well, sadly, that's as far as we can go today. So, Mallory, you've been on the screen the whole time, so when you go to YouTube to watch this, it'll be just looking